Greetings, vinyl community. I'm here today to talk about some different pressings of one of my favorite albums of all time and one of the best albums of the early to mid 2000s, and that is the Mars Volta's 2003 album, De-Loused in the Comatorium. Now, this album has been in discussion for quite a bit recently because of the recent vinyl reissues of the complete Mars Volta catalog that has been undertaken by Clouds Hill Records. And there's been a lot of talk about the new masterings and the new pressings of these releases, particularly what is very obviously their best album, which is De-Loused in the Comatorium. I know some people may really like Francis the Mute, but I think for most people, including myself, De-Loused is the Mars Volta at their most pure and unadulterated. And it's definitely the release I go back to the most. There is a lot of speculation and word-of-mouth information going on about these new pressings, especially talking about the older 2014 Music on Vinyl pressings and, of course, the highly sought-after, highly expensive original vinyl pressings by Gold Standards Laboratories. De-Loused in the Comatorium is the Mars Volta's 2003 debut album, their first full-length album after the release of their Tremulant EP. This was a band that was formed by Cedric bixler-Zavala and Omar Rodriguez-Lopez out of the ashes of the legendary At the Drive-In, right after they released their magnum opus, Relationship of Command, and then almost immediately broke up afterwards, right as they were starting to get recognition. This album, Relationship of Command, is, I think, one of the best post-hardcore albums ever made. It is a ferocious punk rock masterpiece, and in many ways, De-Loused in the Comatorium is a continuation of the sound that I think Omar Rodriguez-Lopez and Cedric bixler-Zavala were seeking on Relationship of Command, but obviously, there were other people in that band kind of holding them to a more firm, structured punk rock aesthetic and root. And you kind of see that in the early Sparta albums, which I also think are excellent albums. Those first couple Sparta albums are fantastic. But De-Loused was really something special, and early Mars Volta was really something special. I mean, there were a lot of dark things going on in the band at this time, the death of Jeremy and Michael Ward, really bad opioid addiction, so I don't mean to downplay any of that, but this album here, De-Loused, is by all intents and purposes lightning in a bottle. This is, I think, even more of a monumental feat than Relationship of Command, and that's saying something because I love that album. For the longest time, I only had the CD of this album, as I think most people did. The original vinyl pressing, released in 2003 on Gold Standards Laboratories, goes for a lot of money, has always gone for a lot of money because it was very limited and it was released in a time when vinyl releases were not normal. They were kind of, trinkets, trivial things, not serious. It wasn't taken seriously as a music format at that time. Now, I'm going to be talking mostly today about sound quality of these releases, and while I have not heard the original Gold Standard Laboratories pressing, I can say with almost complete assuredness that it is going to be the worst of the three pressing options available. The only thing that might be worse sounding than that is maybe a bootleg. But the reason why I would avoid the Gold Standard Laboratories pressing at all costs is it is a picture disc. And if you know anything about the way picture discs are made, they're just never going to sound good. They are cool trinkets and toys. They are not meant to be serious items for music reproduction. So I would avoid the Gold Standard Laboratories pressing. It's a collectible only, I feel like. Now, the next option you have that was released in 2014 is this right here, the Music on Vinyl pressing. Now, there's a lot of controversy about this release, started by the band themselves, and I think I talked about it in one of my other videos. For those not familiar, Music on Vinyl is a well-known vinyl reissue label. They have their own pressing plant in the Netherlands, record industry. They do mostly pressings that are mastered from high-resolution digital files. That's the bulk of their catalog. They tend to do a lot of 80s and 90s releases, a lot of alternative rock, things like that. They're not the most audiophile of the specialty reissue labels. They're nothing like Analog Productions or Mobile Fidelity, but I have generally found their releases to be of pretty high quality. The pressings they do at Record Industry in the Netherlands are pretty high quality. The mastering jobs are usually pretty good. The jackets, they use glossy jackets. I don't think they're true tip-on jackets, but they're decent glossy jackets. And so I was really excited when I 6 years ago, got this reissue on vinyl of De-Loused in the Comatorium, pressed by Music on Vinyl. And overall, I do think it's a high-quality release. There's been a lot of people talking on the internet about, the artwork being low quality on this release. I don't see that at all. Now, the artwork is a little bit different than the artwork that's on the new Clouds Hill reissue, and I don't just mean in terms of changing the front and back cover, but I also mean in terms of they use slightly different versions of the images, the color grading is a little different, but I don't see anything low quality about the artwork on this jacket, and the jacket itself is really nice, and the pressing is pretty good. I'm going to wait to talk about the sound until I talk about the Clouds Hill reissue, but I do want to talk a little bit about the controversy that this release spawned. So after this was released by Music on Vinyl, Cedric Bixler-Zavala, the vocalist of the Mars Volta, and one of really only the two that make up the core duo of this band, went on Twitter and attacked these releases as bootlegs. He said they were not authorized by the band. They are bootlegs. Don't buy them. They're low quality. We'll be coming out with our own vinyl releases, etc., etc., etc. A lot of people that don't know about record licensing and don't know about how reissues get put out, kind of jumped on this, and there was a lot of speculation and a lot of just patently false information going on around the internet around this time. And all Music on Vinyl did end up pulling this from their release, I think not because they had to legally, but because they didn't need the press frenzy around this release. So that's why these reissues are a little on the scarce side, because they I guess they pulled it from production early, or they just didn't do any repressings of it once it was out there, once it was released. Despite the fact that it's nice when artists have control over their catalog, the reality in the 21st century is that record labels almost always own distribution and release rights on all this music. Anything released on a major label, the label is going to be able to control how it gets put out, when it gets reissues, who they're licensing the reissues to. That is almost always controlled by major labels. And of course, the Mars Volta recorded this album on Universal. So Universal to some degree, I don't know the legal ins and outs, they essentially own this record, despite whatever the Mars Volta have in their contract. Music on Vinyl legally licensed this release from Universal, just as Analog Productions would license releases from the label holders when they do a release. Music on Vinyl did the same thing here and got an official licensing from Universal to press this record. It is not, by any stretch of the imagination, a bootleg. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we know about the mastering and the pressing on this. Obviously, it's pressed at Record Industry in the Netherlands. The mastering for vinyl credit on this release is by Peter Lyman. He is the same person that gets a vinyl mastering credit on the original picture disc release. From everything, I haven't heard the original picture disc release, but from everything I'm able to gather, this Music on Vinyl pressing uses, as far as I can tell, the same vinyl mastering as the original Gold Standard Laboratories pressing. As far as I'm able to tell, that's what it's credited as. Now, what I don't know is it using the same mastering files, or are they using the same metal parts? And here we get into talking about, digital and tapes and things like that. So from everything I've been able to gather, I believe this album was recorded on tape back in 2002, 2003. But from what I've been able to gather, it seems like both the mastering for CD and for the original vinyl release were done digitally. And that was very common at that time, as recording studios were still switching over to digital, but the big labels had mostly digital mastering, so they would record the album on tape and master it digitally for CD release, or alternatively for a vinyl release here. That seems to be what happened here. Now, what I don't know is when they pressed it at Record Industry, I don't know if they used the original metal parts from the original pressing, or if they used if they did a new lacquer cut from the digital mastering for vinyl by Peter Lyman. That's what we don't know. That's what we don't have the information on. So, and that also begs the question, normally music on vinyl, record industry, they cut their albums from high resolution digital files, typically. We don't know if that was the case here. We don't know if this was cut from a high res like 9624 file, master file, or if it was cut from a lower quality CD quality 1644 file. We don't know that. We do know it was mastered specifically for vinyl. So the people saying that this was pressed from a CD just simply don't know what they're talking about, because despite the fact that it could be mastered from digital files that are at CD quality, CD resolution, that doesn't mean that it was mastered using this, that it was pressed using the CD master. Because vinyl mastering is different. It's a different format. It requires a different type of mastering than what would be used for a CD master, and so it would require a separate mastering that is specifically for vinyl. And I do have some records that were cut from CD masters. They sound like dog shit. This does not sound like dog shit. It actually sounds quite a bit better than my original CD copy. So that's the good thing about this release. So overall, I was quite happy with this. It's an improvement on the original CD mastering. It's pressed nicely. It's a high quality product. But it did not go through the approval of the band. The band weren't happy. They wanted to have control over the vinyl pressings of their albums. So, it's a big dust up because of that. But rest assured, this is not a bootleg. And anyone calling it a bootleg just doesn't know how record pressing and record reissues work. Now, that brings us to this release. This is the 2021 Clouds Hill reissue, authorized by the band. So they made a big deal about this. They took them like 6 years to finally get this out. They were saying, don't buy that bootleg release. We're going to put out our records right away. And then we waited and we waited and we waited. I'm sure there was a lot of stuff legally going on behind the scenes there, but still, it doesn't exactly look good for the band when they bash an official release from their label and then say they're putting out one and they don't put it out for 6 years. It's a little bit of a letdown. On social media, if I recall correctly, Omo Rodriguez-Lopez and Cedric Bixler-Zavala, they were talking about how they possessed the original analog master tapes for De-Loused in these early Mars Volta albums. And so when these were announced, and they were promoted, they were announced to be reissued from the original analog master tapes. The truth is that while they may have been mastered using the original analog tapes as a source, the mastering was done, I have information here, was done from 9624 high-res files. So what they did is probably they took the master tapes, did a high-resolution scan of them, and then from that digital scan of the master tape, then they mastered the record digitally. And so I kind of take an issue with the idea that they're saying, oh, mastered from the original master tapes, because a lot of labels like to use that muddy wording, and it's not, it implies something that it's not. This is not an analog mastering. This is not a full analog record, even though the original recordings are on analog tapes, apparently. This is not an analog chain record. It was mastered digitally. They do state that it was mastered from 9624 high-res files. That may or may not be higher resolution than the music on vinyl and original pressings. We don't know, because we don't have information about what type of digital files those were cut from. But these were mastered by different people. So these were mastered for vinyl by Chase von Autenkranz and Florian Siller at Soundgarden Mastering in Hamburg, Germany. This release, this Clouds Hill release, also uses the band's preferred artwork layout, which switches the back and front cover. This is really fantastic artwork by artist Storm Thorgerson, and it is treated very nicely here. Now, the jacket on this Clouds Hill release is high quality. It's not tip-on just like the music on vinyl one, but it's not glossy. It is just a standard cardboard jacket, but it's still nice and thick, and the artwork really pops on it. I don't really have an opinion on the replacing of the back and front cover artwork. Apparently this is something the band originally wanted to have on the cover, and this was supposed to be the back cover, and the record label, I guess, overruled them. That seems to be what I've gathered. So, like the music on vinyl pressing, this record was also pressed in Europe. These Clouds Hill reissues are pressed at Optimal Records in Germany. Optimal is a very, very big record pressing plant. I have a lot of records pressed at Optimal. They are about on equal footing in terms of pressing quality as record industry in the Netherlands. I think both record pressing plants are good, but not excellent. You know, they're not as good as RTI. They're not as good as Palace in Germany. They are not as good as the Acoustic Sounds plant in Salina, Kansas, but they are good. They're certainly better than places like GZ or places like, well, now defunct Rainbow Records or Universal in the US, which is by far the worst pressing plant. So Palace is good enough for a release like this. You know, this is not the big bucks audiophile reissues. So I'm giving you guys all this information to basically state that while these releases physically are a little different, in terms of the actual quality of the physical product, they're about the same. There isn't really a major difference between the two other than the switched artwork that uses slightly different versions of the artwork. You can see here on the back that the cloud patterns are a little different, the color grading is a little different, but looking at these up close, I don't see the quality difference. I see just different versions of the artwork. But the real reason I made this video is to talk about the sound. So now I'm going to talk about the sound of the reissue and the way it was remastered. So this is a significantly different sound than the music on vinyl and the original CD sound. Overall, I found this pressing, the Clouds Hill reissue, to be a warmer sounding pressing, warmer sounding mastering. Things are a little more round, a little softer than the music on vinyl and original mastering, which is a little more a little more sharp, a little more punchy, a little more bright. I found this to be a little bit of a more organic sound, but the soundstage was a lot wider on this Clouds Hill reissue. The stage was deeper. It just felt like a more expansive sound. The guitar tones had you could tell the different guitar tones, the differences in them a lot more. I think the guitars overall on this reissue were a lot better. Overall, I had my sheet of notes here, and I'm not going to go through all of them. Overall, I would say I prefer the sound on this new Clouds Hill reissue. It's not quite as punchy in some places as the music on vinyl or original mastering. I'm just going to keep referring to it as the music on vinyl mastering because it does use the mastering as apparently that was originally done for the record. But the music on vinyl, it does get a little grating after times. It's definitely mixed with a little bit more what we call loudness, where it's kind of like a wall of sound. The soundstage is a lot narrower, and the vocals, while their vocals are a little bit clearer, Cedric's vocals are a little sharper on the original, the music on vinyl. It's grating after a while, and it sounds a little thin after a while. And the soundstage is much narrower, and everything seems a little more smashed together. So I think if you were to A/B them using like 30-second clips, I think the immediate response is kind of to prefer the music on vinyl because it just sounds a little bit louder and a little bit more direct. But I think after listening to the whole album, no question I prefer the new reissue, the Clouds Hill. I think it's a much more organic presentation. The band seems more spread out. The cymbals have more texture about them. The drums might not be quite as snappy, but they do sound more, I think, like real drums and not like percussive effects. The only criticism I have of this new reissue is, for some reason, the organ doesn't sound quite as present. The great organ playing by the late Ike Owens on this record is fantastic, and it just doesn't sound quite as present on this reissue as on the music on vinyl. But for every other instrument, I feel like this does a much better job of capturing the band, and especially the kind of more textured interludes. A lot of the electronic manipulation done by the late Jeremy Ward sounds a lot better, sounds a lot fuller and meatier and more nuanced and dynamic on this Clouds Hill pressing than on the Music on Vinyl. So overall, the Clouds Hill reissue wins. It just sounds a lot better. It sounds less congested, it sounds more natural, it sounds more open. I was skeptical because, Music on Vinyl, in some regards, are considered a bit of an audiophile label. Not that much of an audiophile label, but they do releases that are geared towards the people that, like the audiophile pressings. But I think the result of this new mastering is that this is the superior sounding version of this great record. Just to look at my notes briefly to drive home this point, my favorite track on the album, and I think most people, is Cicatriz ESP, which is one of the longest tracks in the album. It's also kind of one of the more proggy and expansive tracks, and there's a lot of very ferocious bursts of energy on this track, and then there is a lot of space, a lot of nuance. And I found that on this reissue, this Clouds Hill pressing, not only did the slower parts, the more expansive parts, sound better and more dynamic, but sometimes on the Music on Vinyl pressing, when the whole band would come in on those big moments, on those big tutti moments, it would sound pressed. It would sound, it surprised you, it hit you, it was sharp, but it was congested and boxed in. It was like a wall of sound, a wall of loudness, and I don't think on this new Clouds Hill pressing, when that would happen, yeah, sure, the snare drum didn't have quite the sharp ring that the Music on Vinyl pressing had, but when those big climaxes happened, it did sound like a whole band playing instead of this compressed, boxed-in, squeezed sound. It sounded much bigger. It made the dynamic contrast sound both more realistic and more full. So, yeah, I'm really happy with this. This record will never be an audiophile record. It's not going to sound like Pink Floyd. It's not going to sound like the old King Crimson records. It is a mid-2000s rock record, and it's mastered like a mid-2000s rock record. It's mixed like a mid-2000s rock record. But that being said, this is a fantastic album, a very important album in the evolution of rock music, and it's one of my favorite albums. And because of that, I want to have the best sounding version I possibly can. And I do think this Clouds Hill reissue, reluctantly I say, it is the best sounding version of this album that is out there right now. They did a good job. So hats off to the mastering team and the Clouds Hill reissue team. They did a nice job. So that's the good news. The good news is the best sounding version of this album is in print right now. For fans of the Mars Volta that found this video, you guys probably already have this. If you haven't picked it up already, what are you doing? But for those who watch my channel who might not be that familiar with this group, get this album while you still can. It's a fantastic, progressive, psychedelic rock record that, if you like King Crimson, Pink Floyd, if you like even Santana, or stuff like that, or even like 70s Miles Davis, you're going to find a lot to like in this record. It's definitely, it's a grower. It's a record that you can't just listen to snippets of. You kind of have to sit down and digest the whole thing, and you might have to do that multiple times, but this album's very rewarding. It has a lot to show you. It's one of those albums that with each listen just grows on you, and it's grown on me over the last 15 years definitely, and has remained one of my favorite albums of this period. It's this is one of the bands that really got me into a lot of the music that I would go on to listen to later in life. So highly recommended this 2021 Clouds Hill vinyl reissue, the Mars Volta, De-Loused in the Comatorium. And that's all I gotta say. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time. Cheers.